Caesar's Messiah, the Roman conspiracy to invent Jesus. What if everything you thought you knew about Christianity was a carefully crafted lie? What if the most influential story in human history wasn't divine revelation, but political propaganda designed to control millions of people? And what if the evidence for this conspiracy has been hiding in plain sight for nearly 2,000 years? Today, we're diving into one of the most controversial theories ever proposed about the origins of Christianity. We're exploring the explosive claim that Jesus Christ never existed as a historical figure, and that the entire New Testament was fabricated by Roman emperors as a tool of mass manipulation. This isn't just another religious debate. This is about uncovering what might be the greatest deception in human history. I'm going to walk you through the shocking evidence that suggests Christianity was invented by a forgotten dynasty of Roman Caesars called the Flavians. We'll examine how they allegedly used sophisticated literary techniques to create a fake Messiah, how they borrowed from existing religions to make their story believable, and why they went to such extraordinary lengths to deceive an entire empire. By the end of this investigation, you'll have all the pieces of Ali change how we puzzle that could fundamentally understand not just Christianity, but the very nature of power and propaganda throughout history. But before we dive into this rabbit hole, I need to make something clear. This isn't an attack on anyone's personal faith or beliefs. Millions of people find genuine meaning, comfort, and moral guidance in Christianity, and that has real value regardless of its historical origins. What we're examining here is the historical and political context surrounding the creation of these texts. Whether you're a believer, a skeptic, or somewhere in between, understanding how power structures have shaped religious narratives throughout history is crucial for any thinking person in today's world. So let's start with the basic question that launched this entire investigation. If Jesus was a real historical figure who lived in first-century Palestine, why is there such a glaring absence of contemporary evidence for his existence? Think about it this way. According to the Gospels, Jesus was supposedly performing miracles in front water into wine, raising of thousands of people. He was turning the dead, feeding multitudes with a few loaves of bread, and causing such a stir that the Roman authorities felt compelled to execute him. The Gospels describe him as a figure of immense popularity and controversy who drew massive crowds wherever he went. Yet when we look for contemporary accounts of this remarkable figure, we find nothing. Not a single historian, philosopher, or chronicler who was actually alive during the time Jesus supposedly lived bothered to mention him. This isn't just surprising, it's historically unprecedented. We have extensive records from this period describing much less significant figures and events, but the man who allegedly turned the world upside down left no trace in the historical record of his own time. Even more puzzling is the fact that the Gospels themselves weren't written by eyewitnesses. Despite church tradition assigning names like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John to these texts, biblical scholars widely agree that these books were written by anonymous authors decades after the supposed events they describe. The earliest gospel, Mark, wasn't composed until around 70 CE at the earliest, a full 40 years after Jesus allegedly died. This creates a fascinating historical puzzle. How did a collection of anonymous texts, written in Greek rather than the Aramaic that Jesus supposedly spoke, come to form the foundation of what would become the world's largest religion? And why do these texts, which claim to tell the story of a Jewish mess, contain such a distinctly pro-Roman perspective? To understand how we got here, we need to travel back to one of the tumultuous periods in ancient Most-Tum history. The year is 66 CE, and the Roman Empire is facing its greatest internal crisis since the civil wars that brought down the Republic. The Jews of Palestine have risen in massive rebellion against their Roman occupiers, and for the first time in centuries, Rome's iron grip on one of its provinces is slipping. This wasn't just any rebellion. This was a holy war fueled by messianic fervor. The Jewish rebels believed that their scriptures prophesied the coming of a warrior Messiah who would drive out the foreign oppressors and restore Israel to its former glory. They had succeeded in defeating Roman forces and establishing an independent Jewish state right in the heart of the empire. For Rome, this was an existential threat that demanded the most drastic response. Enter the Flavians. Vespasian and his son Titus were Rome's most experienced and ruthless military commanders. They had already proven their ability to crush religious resistance movements, having spent years systematically destroying the Druid priesthood in Britain and Gaul. When Emperor Nero needed someone to handle the Jewish rebellion, the Flavians were the obvious choice. What happened next would reshape not just the political landscape of the Roman Empire, but possibly the entire course of Western civilization. The Flavians didn't just crush the Jewish rebellion with overwhelming military force. They may have also engineered one of history's most sophisticated psychological warfare operations, creating an entirely new religion designed to neutralize future Jewish resistance. The military campaign itself followed a predictable pattern. The Flavians assembled a massive army and began their systematic conquest of Jewish strongholds, starting in the northern region of Galilee before moving south toward Jerusalem. But something unusual happened during this campaign that would prove crucial to understanding what came next. In the early stages of the war, the Romans captured a Jewish rebel leader named Joseph ben Matityahu. This man would later become known to history as Flavius Josephus, and his transformation from Jewish rebel to Roman collaborator represents one of the most dramatic turnarounds in ancient history. Josephus claimed to be a prophet and convinced his captors that Jewish scripture foretold that Vespasian would become emperor. When this prophecy appeared to come true, Josephus became not just a trusted advisor to the Flavians, but an adopted member of their family. This is where our story takes a fascinating turn. Josephus became the official historian of the Jewish war, tasked with writing the definitive account of Rome's victory. But he wasn't just recording events. He was interpreting them through the lens of Jewish prophecy. According to Josephus, the Jewish rebels had misunderstood their own scriptures. The Messiah they were waiting for wasn't a Jewish liberator at all. It was Vespasian and his dynasty. The prophecies that spoke of a world ruler coming out of Palestine referred not to a son of David, but to the Roman general who conquered Palestine. This reinterpretation of Jewish messianic prophecy would become a cornerstone of Flavian propaganda. But the beginning of what may it was just have been a much larger and more ambitious project. Because around the same time that Josephus was writing his histories, another set of texts began to appear that told the story of a very Messiah. Unlike different kind of Jewish the militant, nationalist messiahs described in the Dead Sea Scrolls and other authentic Jewish literature of the period, this new Messiah preached pacifism, submission to Roman authority, and the payment of taxes to Caesar. He performed his ministry not in the war-torn landscape of first-century Palestine, but in a curiously peaceful version of that region that bore little resemblance to historical reality. Most importantly, this Messiah's teaching served Roman interests perfectly, advocating for exactly the kind of compliant, non-resistant Judaism that would pose no threat to imperial rule. The emergence of Christianity during the Flavian period represents one of history's most remarkable coincidences, if indeed it was a coincidence at all. At the exact moment when Rome needed a way to pacify Jewish messianic expectations, a new form of Judaism appeared that accomplished precisely that goal. This new religion not only neutralized Jewish resistance, it actually encouraged Jews to worship their Roman conquerors without even realizing it. But how could Roman pagans possibly create convincing Jewish literature? The answer lies in understanding the sophisticated network of collaborators that the Flavians assembled around them. These weren't just military men, they were part of an intellectual elite that included some of the most learned Jewish scholars of their day. Beyond Josephus, the Flavians had connections to other prominent Jewish families who had already begun the work of synthesizing Jewish beliefs with Greek and Roman philosophy. The Alexandrian Jewish community in Egypt, for example, had produced figures like Philo of Alexandria, whose writings combined Jewish theology with Platonic philosophy in ways that would later become central to Christian doctrine. These were wealthy, cosmopolitan Jews who had already moved far from the militant nationalism of the Palestinian rebels. The Flavians also had intimate connections with the Herodian dynasty, the Roman-appointed rulers of Palestine. Princess Berenice, a member of the Herod family, became the mistress of Titus and may have played a crucial role in the development of Christian theology. These relationships created a perfect storm of political motivation, literary expertise, and theological innovation that could have produced the sophisticated religious synthesis we see in the New Testament. What emerges from this historical context is a picture far removed from the traditional narrative of Christianity's origins. Instead of a grassroots religious movement spreading organically among Jewish peasants and fishermen, we see what appears to be a carefully orchestrated propaganda campaign designed and implemented by the Roman imperial court. The question isn't whether the Romans had the motivation to create such a religion, but whether they had the means and opportunity to pull it off. The evidence suggests they had both in abundance. The Flavians controlled the largest propaganda apparatus in the ancient world, with the ability to produce and distribute literature across the entire Mediterranean region. They had access to the finest writers, scholars, and intellectuals of their day. Most importantly, they had captured the Jewish scriptures during the siege of Jerusalem and possessed the theological knowledge necessary to create convincing messianic literature. This brings us to one of the most intriguing aspects of the entire theory. If the Flavians really did create Christianity, they left behind what amounts to a signature embedded within the texts themselves. This signature takes the form of a sophisticated literary technique called typology, a method of connecting different stories through parallel names, locations, and events occurring in the same sequence. When we examine the Gospels alongside the historical works of Josephus, we find an extraordinary pattern of parallels between the ministry of Jesus and the military campaign of Titus. These parallels are too numerous and too precise to be coincidental, suggesting that the Gospel narratives were deliberately constructed to mirror the historical events of the Jewish war. This typological connection goes far beyond simple coincidence. It represents what appears to be a deliberate literary signature, a way for the Flavians to mark their authorship for those who knew how to read between the lines. Both Jesus and Titus begin their respective journeys at the Sea of Galilee, gathering followers who will accompany them on their missions. Both travel through the Galilean countryside, encounter resistance, and ultimately make their way to Jerusalem, where their campaigns reach their climactic conclusions. But these parallels become truly remarkable when we examine the specific details. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus tells his disciples they will become catchers of men. In Josephus's historical account, Titus literally makes his soldiers catchers of men when they use spears to fish Jewish rebels out of the Sea of Galilee after sinking their boats. The wordplay here is unmistakable, and it's written in the same literary style that characterized Flavian court literature. Consider another striking parallel. In the Gospels, Jesus encounters a man possessed by a legion of demons at Gadara. These demons are cast out and enter a herd of swine, which then rushes into the sea and drowns. In Josephus's account, Titus fights a battle at the exact same location, Gadara, where he defeats a legion of Jewish rebels who are then driven into the sea where they drown. The Gospels have transformed a brutal military victory into a spiritual allegory, but the underlying structure remains identical. Perhaps most telling is the parallel involving crucifixion itself. Josephus records that during the siege of Jerusalem, he witnessed 3 of his friends being crucified and pleaded with Titus for their release. Titus granted this request. The 3 men were taken down from their crosses, and while 2 died, 1 survived. This personal anecdote from Josephus's own life becomes, in the Gospels, the story of Jesus being taken down from the cross by Joseph of Arimathea and subsequently returning to life. The name connection here is particularly revealing. Joseph of Arimathea appears to be a literary pun on Joseph bar Matityahu, which was Josephus's original Jewish name before he became a Roman citizen. Arimathea isn't a real place that can be located historically, but it sounds remarkably similar to the Aramaic rendering of bar Matityahu. This kind of wordplay was typical of the literary games that Roman authors enjoyed playing with their educated readers. These parallels extend throughout both narratives, creating what amounts to a complete typological overlay. Jesus predicts that Jerusalem will be encircled by a wall, and Titus fulfills this prophecy by building a siege wall around the city. Jesus speaks of a temple that will be destroyed with not one stone left upon another, and Titus carries out this exact about a generation that will not pass away before destruction. Jesus talks these events occur, and Titus accomplishes everything within the prescribed 40-year time frame that defined a Jewish generation. What makes this pattern even more compelling is that it wasn't just hidden from casual readers. The Flavians appear to have embedded multiple layers of meaning that would be accessible to different audiences. Common people could read the Gospels as simple moral and spiritual teachings. Educated Romans familiar with Josephus's histories could recognize the typological parallels and understand the political message. Jewish readers trained in scriptural interpretation might detect the way Old Testament prophecies had been repurposed to serve Roman ends. This multi-layered approach reflects the sophisticated propaganda techniques that the Flavians had already perfected in other contexts. They understood that effective psychological warfare required different messages for different audiences, all working toward the same ultimate goal of imperial control. Christianity, in this interpretation, becomes the ultimate example of what we might today call a psyop, a psychological operation designed to neutralize resistance by redirecting religious fervor away from political rebellion and towards spiritual submission. The genius of this system becomes apparent when we consider its long-term effects. Traditional Roman rule relied on military force and the constant threat of violence to maintain order. But force alone was expensive and often counterproductive, especially when dealing with religious movements that welcomed martyrdom. By creating a religion that preached pacifism, love of enemies, and rendering unto Caesar what was Caesar's, the Flavians may have discovered a far more effective method of social control. The early Christian message was perfectly calibrated to serve Roman interests. Instead of the warrior Messiah expected by Jewish rebels, Christians were given a suffering servant who achieved victory through defeat. Instead of political liberation, they were promised spiritual salvation. Instead of resistance to foreign occupation, they were taught to turn the other cheek and pray for their persecutors. It was a complete inversion of the militant messianism that had fueled the Jewish rebellion. This transformation becomes even more remarkable when we consider how thoroughly it succeeded. Within a few centuries, Christianity had spread throughout the Roman Empire and beyond, carrying with it a fundamentally pro-Roman worldview disguised as Jewish prophecy. The religion that claimed to fulfill Jewish messianic expectations had actually neutralized them, channeling religious energy away from political resistance and toward otherworldly concerns. The implications of this theory extend far beyond ancient history. If Christianity really was a Roman invention, it means that for nearly 2 millennia, billions of people have been unknowingly worshipping the very imperial system that their supposed savior was meant to overthrow. The religion that promised liberation had actually perpetuated subjugation, creating what might be the most successful propaganda campaign in human history. But the evidence for Flavian authorship goes beyond literary parallels and historical context. There are also direct genealogical connections between the Flavian family and early Christianity that are difficult to explain if the religion developed independently. Multiple members of the Flavian household became Christian saints, including Flavia Domitilla, who donated the land for the first Christian catacomb and is recognized as the first Christian saint. Her son, Clement, became one of the first popes after the Apostle Peter. Even more intriguing, two members of the Flavian household staff, Nereus and Achilleus, had churches named after them in the earliest Christian dioceses in Rome. This level of penetration into the foundational structures of Christianity by a single Roman family stretches coincidence beyond the breaking point. It suggests instead a level of involvement that goes to the very heart of the religion's creation and early development. The symbolism used by early Christians also bears a striking resemblance to imagery found on Flavian coins. The anchor, boat, fish, olive branch, and star that Clement of Alexandria described as the first Christian symbols were already being used by the Flavian Caesars on their official currency. This suggests that even the visual language of Christianity may have been borrowed from existing imperial iconography. Perhaps most significantly, it was another member of the Flavian family, Constantine, who made Christianity the official religion of Rome in the 4th century. This completes a remarkable historical arc in which the same dynasty that allegedly created Christianity as a tool of imperial control ultimately used it to unify and strengthen their empire. The religion had served its purpose so well that it became indistinguishable from the state itself. This pattern of imperial co-optation helps explain some of the more puzzling aspects of early Christian history. Why were the Gospels preserved and disseminated while other Jewish religious texts from the same period were systematically destroyed? Why did a religion supposedly founded by a crucified criminal become so quickly accepted by Roman authorities? Why did Christian teachings align so perfectly with imperial interests regarding taxation, military service, and civil obedience? The traditional explanations for these questions have never been entirely satisfactory. Divine intervention is obviously not a historical argument. The idea that Christianity succeeded purely through grassroots appeal doesn't account for the massive institutional support that would have been necessary to preserve and spread the texts across the ancient world. The Romans had already demonstrated their ability to completely eradicate religious movements they found threatening, as they had done with the Druids and were in the process of doing with traditional Judaism. But if Christianity was actually a Roman creation from the beginning, all these puzzles resolved themselves. The texts were preserved because they served imperial purposes. The religion was accepted by authorities because it was designed by those same authorities. The teachings aligned with Roman interests because Roman interests were precisely what they were designed to serve. What appeared to be a miraculous triumph of spiritual truth over worldly power, discu triumph of world interpretation also, eyes as spiritual truth. This redly power was actually the curious development. The Gospels weren't of Christian timeline written during the supposed lifetime of Jesus, but emerged decades later during such the Flavian period, when propaganda had been most need-Christianed. The earliest would explains the communities didn't appear in pre-Palestine where Jesus allegedly egged, but in major theological was strongest. The Roman cities where imperial influence development of Christianity followed the political needs of the empire rather than any organic religious evolution. Understanding this timeline becomes crucial when we examine the actual historical context in which these texts emerged. The traditional Christian narrative places Jesus' ministry between 30 and 33 CE, during the reign of Emperor Tiberius and under the governorship of Pontius Pilate. But here's where things get interesting. The Gospels contain chronisms and references numerous anna to events that hadn't yet occurred during that supposed time frame. Most notably, Jesus makes several prophecies about the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, describing in vivid detail how it would be razed with not one stone left upon another. These prophecies are remarkably accurate, which makes perfect sense if they were written after the event rather than before it. The temple was destroyed in 70 CE by Titus's forces, and the descriptions in the Gospels match Josephus's historical accounts with stunning precision. This prophetic accuracy extends beyond the temple's destruction. Jesus predicts that Jerusalem will be surrounded by armies, that there will be great tribulation among the Jews, and that many will be taken captive to all nations. Every one of these predictions came true during the Jewish-Roman War between 66 and 73 CE. The question is whether these were genuine prophecies or historical hindsight disguised as divine foresight. The literary evidence strongly suggests the latter. When ancient authors wanted to give authority to their writings, they often employed a technique called vaticinium ex eventu, or prophecy after the fact. By placing accurate predictions of recent events into the mouth of an earlier figure, they could create the impression that their entire narrative was divinely inspired. The Flavians, with their sophisticated understanding of literature and propaganda, would have been well acquainted with this technique, but the timeline manipulation goes even deeper. The Gospels are carefully structured to place Jesus' ministry exactly 40 years before the destruction of Jerusalem. In Jewish tradition, 40 years represented a complete generation, and this timing wasn't ideal. By backdating their story precisely 40 years, the Flavian authors created the perfect prophetic framework. Jesus could predict events that would come to pass within a generation, and when those events occurred exactly on schedule, it would appear to validate the entire Christian message. This careful chronological manipulation explains one of the most puzzling aspects of early Christianity. If Jesus really had performed the miracles described in the Gospels, if he had drawn the massive crowds mentioned in the texts, if he had caused the kind of disturbance that led to his execution by Roman authorities, why is there absolutely no contemporary historical record of these events? The answer may be that these events were backdated into a period when no one alive could contradict the accounts. Consider the implications of this timing. By placing Jesus' story in the Julio-Claudian period, the Flavians accomplished several strategic goals simultaneously. They created distance between their own reign and the supposed events, making contradiction difficult. They placed responsibility for Jesus' execution on their predecessors rather than themselves, allowing them to appear as potential allies rather than enemies of the new faith. Most importantly, they positioned themselves as the fulfillment of Jesus' prophecies about the coming Son of Man. This brings us to one of the most startling revelations in the entire theory. According to the Gospels, Jesus prophesied that a figure called the Son of Man would come before the generation listening to his words had passed away. This Son of Man would destroy the Galilean towns, surround Jerusalem with walls, and raise the temple. Every one of these prophecies was fulfilled by Titus during his military campaign through Palestine. The implications are staggering. If the Flavians wrote the Gospels, they essentially created a narrative in which Jesus prophesied the coming of Titus as the Son of Man. Christians waiting for the second coming of Christ may have been unknowingly waiting for an event that had already occurred. The Messiah they expected had already come, but he came as a Roman general rather than a Jewish liberator. This realization transforms our understanding of early Christian theology. The concept of the Son of Man wasn't an abstract spiritual idea. It Titus was a specific reference Flavius and his divine mission to fulfill Jewish prophecy through military conquest. When early Christians worshipped Jesus, they were actually worshipping the deified Titus without realizing it. The religion had achieved the ultimate goal of imperial propaganda, getting conquered peoples to worship their conquerors voluntarily. The sophistication of this theological manipulation becomes even more apparent when we examine how the Flavians used existing religious concepts to create their new synthesis. They didn't invent Christianity from whole cloth. They carefully assembled elements from multiple sources to create something that would appeal to different audiences while serving their ultimate political goals. From Judaism, they borrowed the messianic framework and the authority of ancient prophecy. From Greek philosophy, particularly the Platonic concepts that Jewish thinkers like Philo had already begun incorporating into their theology, they drew ideas about the divine logos and the relationship between the spiritual and material worlds. From Roman imperial religion, they took the structural framework of divine emperorship and the sacrificial meal that connected worshippers to their deified rulers. Perhaps most cleverly, they borrowed extensively from the mystery religions that were already popular throughout the Roman Empire, the story of a dying and rising God-man, the concept of salvation through identification with divine suffering, the ritual consumption of bread and wine representing the god's body and blood. All of these elements existed in various mystery cults long before Christianity appeared. The genius of the Flavian synthesis was that it combined these familiar religious elements in a way that served specific political purposes, while maintaining enough spiritual authenticity to attract genuine believers, a religion that felt create. They both ancient and revolutionary, both Jewish and universal, olisatif, both spirituing and politically useful. This multi-sourced approach also explains some of the internal contradictions within Christian theology that have puzzled scholars for centuries. When you're combining elements from different religious traditions, some inconsistencies are inevitable. The tension between predestination and free will, the relationship between faith and works, the nature of the Trinity. All of these theological puzzles make more sense when viewed as the natural result of synthesizing different religious systems, rather than as mysteries revealed through divine inspiration. The Flavian approach to religious engineering was remarkably sophisticated, but it wasn't unprecedented. Throughout history, successful imperial powers have understood the importance of controlling religious narratives. The Romans themselves had a long tradition of incorporating the gods of conquered peoples into their own pantheon, but usually in ways that reinforced Roman supremacy rather than challenging it. What made the Christian project different was its scope and ambition. Rather than simply adding another god to the Roman pantheon, the Flavians appear to have created an entirely new religious system designed to replace the dangerous messianic expectations that had fueled Jewish resistance. They weren't just managing existing religious beliefs, they were engineering new ones from the ground up. This level of religious manipulation required resources and expertise that only an imperial court could provide. Creating convincing religious literature required teams of skilled writers, editors, and theologians. Distributing these texts throughout the empire required access to the Roman road system and postal service. Ensuring that the new religion would be accepted rather than suppressed required coordination with imperial authorities at every level. The scale of this operation becomes apparent when we consider how rapidly Christianity spread throughout the Roman world. Traditional explanations for this rapid expansion focus on the appeal of Christian teachings or the dedication of Christian missionaries. But these explanations don't account for the infrastructure that would have been necessary to preserve and distribute the texts, establish communities, and maintain theological consistency across vast distances. If Christianity was indeed a Flavian creation, this rapid expansion makes perfect sense. The religion spread quickly because it had imperial backing from the beginning. The texts were preserved because they were never actually threatened with destruction. The theological consistency was maintained because there was a central authority coordinating the entire operation. This interpretation also explains one of the most puzzling aspects of early Christian history: the relationship between Christianity and the Roman state. Traditional accounts describe centuries of persecution, followed by sudden acceptance under Constantine. But this narrative doesn't match the historical evidence very well. While some Christians were certainly persecuted, the persecution was neither as systematic nor as severe as later Christian writers claimed. More importantly, the periods of most intense persecution coincided with attempts by certain emperors to revive traditional Roman religion, rather than with any systematic opposition to Christianity as such. The emperors who persecuted Christians were often the same ones who opposed other forms of foreign religious influence, suggesting that their concern was maintaining traditional Roman values rather than suppressing Christianity specifically. When we examine which Christians were actually persecuted, an interesting pattern emerges. The targets were often those who refused to participate in imperial cult activities, or who preached messages that challenged Roman authority directly. The Christians who suffered most were frequently those whose interpretation of Christianity conflicted with Roman interests, while those who preached accommodation with imperial power were generally left alone. This selective persecution makes sense if Christianity was originally designed to serve Roman purposes, but had begun developing in directions that the imperial authorities found threatening. Some Christian communities may have strayed from the original Flavian program, developing more radical interpretations that needed to be suppressed. Others may have been infiltrated by genuinely anti-Roman elements who used Christian networks to spread subversive messages. The eventual triumph of Orthodox Christianity under Constantine can be understood as the reassertion of the original Flavian program after centuries of theological drift. Constantine didn't convert the Roman Empire to Christianity, so much as he converted Christianity back to its original pro-imperial orientation. The Council of Nicaea and subsequent theological developments standardized Christian doctrine in ways that served imperial unity and authority. This interpretation transforms our understanding of the entire arc of early Christian history. What appeared to be the miraculous triumph of a persecuted minority becomes instead the successful implementation of a long-term imperial strategy. The religion that claimed to represent the oppressed had actually been designed by their oppressors as a more efficient method of control. The psychological sophistication of this approach becomes apparent when we consider its long-term effects. Traditional methods of imperial control relied on fear and force, which inevitably generated resistance and resentment. By creating a religion that encouraged voluntary submission to authority while promising spiritual rewards for earthly suffering, the Flavians may have discovered a far more effective approach to social control. Christianity taught its followers to accept their lot in life, to render unto Caesar what was Caesar's, and to focus on heavenly rather than earthly rewards. It channeled revolutionary energy away from political action and towards spiritual contemplation. Most importantly, it reframed suffering and oppression as divinely ordained tests rather than injustices that demanded correction. This reframing was perhaps the most brilliant aspect of the entire operation. Instead of trying to convince people that their suffering didn't matter, Christianity convinced them that their suffering had cosmic significance. Instead of promising immediate relief from oppression, it promised eternal reward for enduring oppression patiently. Instead of encouraging resistance to unjust authority, it taught that all authority came from God and should be respected accordingly. The effectiveness of this approach is demonstrated by its longevity. For nearly 2,000 years, Christianity has generally served to reinforce rather than challenge existing power structures. Even when Christian movements have supported social change, they have usually done so within existing institutional frameworks, rather than by advocating for fundamental systemic transformation. This doesn't mean that Christianity has never inspired genuine liberation movements, or that all Christian social action has been co-opted by imperial interests. But it does suggest that the religion's fundamental theological framework makes it more suitable for reinforcing authority than for challenging it. The emphasis on otherworldly rewards, divine sovereignty, and patient endurance of suffering all serve to discourage the kind of direct political action that might threaten established power structures. Understanding this dynamic helps explain why Christianity became so successful within the Roman Empire, and why it has continued to thrive under various imperial and colonial systems throughout history. Rulers have consistently found Christianity useful precisely because it encourages the kind of behavior that makes governing easier: obedience to authority, acceptance of inequality, and focus on spiritual rather than material concerns. This utilitarian approach to religion wasn't unique to the Romans. but they may have perfected it in ways that previous empires hadn't imagined. By creating a religion that appeared to oppose imperial values while actually reinforcing them, they solved one of the fundamental problems of imperial control: how to make subjugated peoples want to remain subjugated. The genius of the system was that it created the illusion of spiritual resistance while eliminating actual political resistance. Christians could feel that they were part of a revolutionary movement that challenged worldly authority while actually behaving in ways that supported that authority. They could identify with a crucified Savior while serving the interests of his crucifiers. They could believe they were following a Jewish Messiah while worshipping a Roman emperor in disguise. This psychological manipulation was so effective that it persisted even after the original architects were long dead. The Flavian dynasty itself lasted only 27 years, but the religious system they allegedly created has endured for 2 millennia. This longevity suggests that they tapped into something fundamental about human psychology and social organization that transcends any particular political system. The key insight seems to be that people are more willing to accept control when they believe they're choosing it freely. By embedding imperial values within a narrative of spiritual liberation, the Flavians may have discovered how to make oppression feel like salvation. The conquered peoples weren't being forced to worship their conquerors. They were choosing to follow a teacher who happened to preach submission to those same conquerors. This brings us to one of the most disturbing implications of the entire theory. If Christianity really was engineered as a control mechanism, then billions of people throughout history have been unknowingly participating in their own subjugation. The religion they believed would set them free was actually designed to keep them in chains, albeit chains so comfortable and familiar that they felt like embraces. But the evidence for this interpretation extends beyond literary analysis and historical speculation. When we examine the actual content of Christian teachings, we find a remarkable consistency with Roman imperial interests that goes far beyond what we might expect from coincidence. Every major Christian doctrine seems calibrated to serve the needs of imperial administration, while undermining the kind of thinking that might lead to effective resistance. Consider the concept of original sin, which teaches that all humans are fundamentally flawed and deserving of punishment. This doctrine serves multiple imperial purposes simultaneously. It undermines human confidence and self-worth, making people more likely to accept authority from external sources. It provides a theological justification for suffering and inequality by suggesting that all hardship is ultimately deserved. Most importantly, it creates a psychological dependency on institutional salvation that can only be provided through officially sanctioned channels. The emphasis on faith over works serves similar imperial interests. By teaching that salvation comes through belief rather than action, Christianity discourages the kind of practical problem-solving that might lead to political organization or social change. People are taught to pray into their own hands, to focus on changing rather than act, to wait for divine intervention rather than take matters their hearts rather than changing their circumstances. Even the Christian concept of love has been interpreted in ways that serve imperial interests. The commandment to love one's enemies becomes a mandate to accept oppression passively. The emphasis on turning the other cheek discourages self-defense against unjust authority. The teaching that the meek shall inherit the earth encourages acceptance of current inequality by promising future rewards that never seem to arrive. This doesn't mean that these teachings are inherently oppressive, or that they can't be interpreted in liberating ways. Many Christian movements throughout history have found genuinely revolutionary messages within these same texts. But it does suggest that the dominant interpretations of Christian doctrine have consistently served the interests of established power structures in ways that seem far too convenient to be accidental. The institutional structure of Christianity also reflects imperial organizational principles in ways that support the Flavian authorship theory. The hierarchical nature of church authority mirrors the Roman administrative system, with bishops corresponding to provincial governors, and the Pope filling a role similar to the emperor himself. The emphasis on orthodoxy and the suppression of alternative interpretations parallels Roman approaches to maintaining ideological control across diverse populations. Even Christian rituals bear striking resemblances to Roman imperial cult practices. The Eucharist, in which believers consume bread and wine representing the body and blood of their deity, closely parallels Roman sacrificial meals in which participants shared food with their gods to establish spiritual communion. The practice of kneeling before religious authorities mirrors the Roman custom of prostration before imperial officials. The use of incense, elaborate vestments, and ceremonial processions all have precedence in Roman imperial religious practice. These similarities become particularly significant when we consider that the early Christian church was headquartered in Rome itself, the very center of imperial power. If Christianity had truly been a grassroots resistance movement opposed to Roman authority, we might expect it to have developed its institutional base somewhere else, perhaps in Jerusalem or another center of Jewish learning. Instead, it flourished in the capital of the empire it supposedly opposed, under the noses of the authorities it allegedly challenged. The geographical spread of early Christianity also follows patterns that suggest imperial involvement rather than organic growth. The religion spread most rapidly along Roman trade routes and established itself first in major administrative centers, rather than in rural areas or among oppressed populations. This distribution pattern makes perfect sense if Christianity was being disseminated through official channels, but it's harder to explain if it was spreading through underground networks of persecuted believers. Archaeological evidence further complicates the traditional narrative of Christian origins. Despite claims of massive persecution and martyrdom, archaeological sites from the first few centuries of Christian history show remarkably little evidence of the kind of destruction and violence we might expect from systematic oppression. Christian burial sites, meeting places, and artifacts appear to have been preserved rather than destroyed, suggesting a level of official tolerance that contradicts accounts of widespread persecution. The preservation of Christian texts themselves presents perhaps the most compelling evidence for imperial involvement. During the same period when the Romans were systematically destroying Jewish religious literature and executing Jewish religious leaders, Christian texts were being copied, distributed, and preserved with remarkable efficiency. The contrast is so stark that it demands explanation beyond simple luck or divine intervention. Consider what happened to other religious movements that genuinely opposed Roman authority. The Druids were eliminated so thoroughly that virtually nothing remains of their literature or religious practices. Jewish messianic texts were hunted down and destroyed so systematically that the Dead Sea Scrolls, hidden in caves, represent almost our only surviving examples. Yet Christian literature not only survived, but flourished during this same period of religious suppression. This differential treatment makes sense only if Christianity was serving Roman interests from the beginning rather than opposing them. The texts were preserved because they were useful to imperial authorities, not despite their opposition to those authorities. The rapid spread of Christianity across the empire becomes comprehensible when viewed as an officially sponsored program, rather than a grassroots uprising. But perhaps the most convincing evidence for the Flavian authorship theory lies in the texts themselves, specifically in the sophisticated literary techniques used to construct the gospel narratives. These techniques reflect a level of education and cultural sophistication that would have been virtually impossible for the Galilean fishermen and other common people who are traditionally credited as Christianity's founders. The Gospels demonstrate intimate familiarity with Greek literary conventions, Roman legal procedures, and Jewish theological concepts in ways that suggest authorship by a highly educated team rather than by individual witnesses. The use of chiasmus, typological parallelism, and other advanced rhetorical techniques requires training in classical rhetoric that would have been available only to members of the educated elite. More specifically, The Gospels show detailed knowledge of Roman military terminology and procedures that would be unusual for Jewish peasants, but perfectly natural for authors connected to the Roman military establishment. The descriptions of crucifixion, Roman legal proceedings, and military organization all display the kind of insider knowledge we might expect from people who had direct experience with these institutions. The linguistic evidence also supports elite authorship. While Jesus supposedly spoke Aramaic, and his early followers were primarily Aramaic-speaking Jews, the Gospels were composed in sophisticated Greek that demonstrates familiarity with Greek philosophical concepts and literary styles. The authors clearly had access to Greek translations of Jewish scripture and were comfortable moving between different linguistic and cultural traditions in ways that suggest cosmopolitan rather than provincial backgrounds. This multilingual, multicultural sophistication points toward authorship within the kind of international intellectual circles that surrounded the Flavian court, rather than among the local Palestinian communities where Jesus supposedly lived and taught. The authors were clearly comfortable with Roman administrative procedures, Greek philosophical concepts, and Jewish theological traditions in ways that suggest they moved easily between these different worlds. The theological synthesis achieved in the Gospels also reflects this cosmopolitan sophistication. The authors successfully combined Jewish messianic expectations with Greek philosophical concepts and Roman political values in ways that created something genuinely new while remaining familiar enough to appeal to audiences from all three traditions. This kind of religious engineering requires not just literary skill, but deep understanding of how different belief systems function psychologically and socially. The result was a religious narrative that could speak to Jewish audiences longing for messianic fulfillment, to Greek audiences interested in philosophical truth, and to Roman audiences concerned with political stability. Each group could find elements that resonated with their existing beliefs while being gradually drawn toward a synthesis that served imperial interests. This universalist approach represents one of Christianity's most distinctive features, but it also supports the theory of Flavian authorship, creating a religion that could appeal across cultural and ethnic boundaries would have been crucial for an imperial propaganda project designed to unify diverse populations under Roman rule. A religion that remained purely Jewish would have had limited appeal to Greek and Roman audiences, while a religion that abandoned Jewish elements entirely would have failed to neutralize Jewish messianic expectations. The Flavian synthesis solved this problem by creating a religion that was simultaneously Jewish and universal, ancient and contemporary, spiritual and political. It preserved enough Jewish elements to satisfy messianic longings while incorporating enough Greek and Roman elements to appeal to broader audiences. Most importantly, it channeled religious energy away from political resistance and towards spiritual submission in ways that served imperial stability. This balancing act required extraordinary sophistication and suggests authorship by people who understood not just literary technique, but also psychology, sociology, and political science. The authors needed to understand how religious movements develop, how they spread, and how they can be shaped to serve political purposes. This kind of knowledge would have been available within the Flavian court, which had already demonstrated expertise in religious manipulation through their previous campaigns against the Druids and their management of the imperial cult. The timeline of gospel composition also supports Flavian authorship. The texts appear to have been written during the period when the Flavians would have been most motivated to create anti-revolutionary religious propaganda. The earliest gospel, Mark, is generally dated to around 70 CE, precisely consoli, when the Flavians were dating their victory over the Jewish rebellion and would have been most concerned about preventing risings. The up-future later Gospels, Matthew and Luke, appear to have been written during the reigns of Domitian and Trajan, when the Flavian system was being institutionalized and expanded throughout the empire. The Gospel of John, traditionally dated to around 100 CE, coincides with the period when Christianity was becoming established as a significant religious force within the Roman system. This chronological progression suggests a coordinated literary project rather than independent testimonies by different authors. The later Gospels build upon and refine the earlier ones in ways that suggest centralized planning and editorial control. The theological development across the four Gospels follows a logical progression that would make sense as parts of a larger propaganda campaign, but seems less likely as spontaneous religious evolution. The canonical selection process that determined which Gospels would be included in the official New Testament also suggests institutional control rather than popular consensus. The criteria used to distinguish canonical from non-canonical texts consistently favored those that supported imperial interests, while rejecting those that contained genuinely subversive messages. Gnostic Gospels that emphasized individual spiritual authority were suppressed in favor of texts that emphasized institutional mediation and hierarchical control. This selection process extended beyond the Gospels to include the entire New Testament canon. The letters attributed to Paul consistently emphasize obedience to governmental authority, acceptance of social inequality, and focus on otherworldly rather than political concerns. These themes serve imperial interests so consistently that they suggest editorial guidance rather than spontaneous religious insight. The Book of Revelation, despite its apparently anti-Roman imagery, actually reinforces imperial theology by depicting divine authority in terms borrowed directly from Roman imperial iconography. The heavenly throne room described in Revelation mirrors the Roman imperial court in its hierarchical structure, ceremonial procedures, an emphasis on absolute submission to divine authority. Even the lake of fire reserved for the damned reflects Roman legal concepts about appropriate punishment for those who resist legitimate authority. When we step back and examine the New Testament as a complete work, what emerges is a remarkably coherent program of political education disguised as religious instruction. Every major theme serves to reinforce the kind of attitudes and behaviors that would make imperial rule easier and more stable. The consistency of this program across different authors and different time periods suggests coordination rather than coincidence. This coordination becomes even more apparent when we compare the New Testament to contemporary Jewish and Christian texts that weren't included in the official canon. The Dead Sea Scrolls, which represent authentic Jewish religious literature from the period, contain radically different messages about resistance to foreign occupation, the importance of ritual purity, and the coming of a warrior Messiah who would destroy Israel's enemies. The Gnostic Gospels, which may represent early Christian traditions that hadn't been filtered through imperial censorship, emphasize individual spiritual authority and direct relationship with the divine rather than institutional mediation. The contrast between canonical and non-canonical texts suggests that the selection process was designed to eliminate genuinely subversive elements while preserving those that served imperial purposes. This kind of editorial control would have been possible only with institutional backing from imperial authorities, not through the decisions of persecuted underground communities. The implications of this analysis extend far beyond academic debates about Christian origins. If the Flavian authorship theory is correct, it means that the most influential religious text in human history was actually a work of political propaganda designed to serve the interests of an imperial dynasty that has been dead for nearly 2,000 years. The religion that billions of people have turned to for spiritual liberation was actually engineered to prevent the kind of thinking that might lead to genuine political liberation. This doesn't necessarily invalidate the spiritual experiences that people have found within Christianity, but it does raise profound questions about the relationship between religious belief and political power. How many other religious movements have been co-opted or created by political authorities to serve their own interests? How can we distinguish between authentic spiritual insights and sophisticated psychological manipulation? What does it mean for human freedom and dignity if our deepest beliefs can be engineered by those who seek to control us? These questions become particularly urgent when we consider how similar techniques might be used in contemporary contexts. The Flavian approach to religious engineering represents an early example of what we might now call psychological warfare or propaganda, and the principles they discovered remain relevant today. Understanding how they managed to create a religion that made oppression feel like liberation might help us recognize when similar techniques are being used against us. The study of Christian origins through this lens also illuminates broader patterns in how power structures maintain themselves across time. The Flavians may have discovered something fundamental about human psychology, that people are more likely to accept control when they believe they're choosing it freely, and that the most effective form of dominance is one that convinces the dominated that their submission is actually a form of liberation. This insight has implications that extend far beyond religious history into contemporary politics, economics, and social organization. How many of our current beliefs and institutions might have been shaped by similar processes of elite manipulation? How can we develop the critical thinking skills necessary to distinguish between authentic choice and manufactured consent? The Flavian thesis forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of truth, authority, and human agency. If one of history's most influential religious movements was actually an elaborate deception, what does that tell us about our ability to discern truth from fiction, especially when the fiction serves powerful interests? How can we maintain healthy skepticism about official narratives while still being open to genuine spiritual and moral insights? These questions don't have easy answers, but asking them may be more important than finding definitive solutions. The process of questioning authority, examining evidence, and thinking critically about received wisdom is itself a form of liberation, regardless of what specific conclusions we reach. Whether or not Christianity was actually invented by Roman emperors, the investigation itself demonstrates the importance of intellectual independence and the dangers of accepting any narrative simply because it's widely believed or officially endorsed. The story of the Flavians and their alleged creation of Christianity serves as a powerful reminder that those in power have always understood the importance of controlling not just bodies, but minds, not just actions, but beliefs. The techniques they may have pioneered continue to evolve and adapt, but the underlying principle remains constant. The most effective form of control is one that convinces people they're free. Understanding this principle doesn't require us to become paranoid or cynical about all authority, but it does suggest the importance of maintaining intellectual vigilance and questioning the sources of our deepest beliefs. Whether we're examining ancient religious texts or contemporary media narratives, the same critical faculties that might help us understand Christian origins can also help us navigate the complex information landscape of our own time. The investigation into Christianity's origins ultimately becomes an investigation into the nature of power itself, and the ongoing struggle between those who seek to control and those who seek to remain free. The Flavians may have won their particular battle, creating a religious system that served imperial interests for centuries. But their victory was never complete, and the human desire for genuine liberation continues to find expression in new forms. The questions raised by the Flavian thesis remind us that this struggle is far from over. In every generation, new forms of power emerge that require new forms of resistance. Understanding how previous generations were controlled can help us recognize and resist the control mechanisms of our own time. The price of freedom, it seems, is not just eternal vigilance, but also the willingness to question everything, especially those beliefs we hold most dear. This realization transforms our understanding of how Christianity may have achieved its remarkable success in converting the Roman Empire. Traditional accounts describe this as a miraculous triumph of truth over power, but the evidence suggests something far more calculated. The Flavians may have discovered that the most effective way to control religious movements wasn't to suppress them, but to create and direct them from within. The genius of this approach becomes apparent when we examine how Christianity spread through the empire's infrastructure. While other religious movements had to work against Roman administrative systems, Christianity seems to have flowed through them effortlessly. The The same roads that carried Roman legions also carried Christian missionaries. The same administrative networks that collected taxes also collected converts. The same legal systems that enforced imperial law also protected Christian communities from persecution. This level of institutional support would have been impossible for a genuinely subversive movement. The Romans had already demonstrated their ability to completely eliminate religious systems they found threatening. The systematic destruction of Druidism in Britain and Gaul showed how thoroughly the imperial machinery could erase unwanted beliefs when it chose to do so. Yet Christianity not only survived, but thrived during this same period, suggesting a level of official tolerance that contradicts accounts of systematic persecution. The archaeological record supports this interpretation. Early Christian sites show remarkably little evidence of the destruction and violence we might expect from centuries of oppression. Instead, we find evidence of gradual development and expansion that suggests official approval rather than underground resistance. Christian catacombs in Rome were constructed with permits from imperial authorities. Christian churches were built using Roman architectural principles and often on sites previously occupied by pagan temples, suggesting continuity rather than conquest. Even more telling is the preservation of Christian manuscripts during a period when other religious texts were being systematically destroyed. The Romans were meticulous record keepers and efficient administrators. They knew how to eliminate unwanted literature when they chose to do so, as evidenced by the near-complete destruction of Jewish messianic texts during the same period. The fact that Christian manuscripts not only survived but proliferated suggests they were serving imperial rather than opposing them. The content of these preserved texts reinforces this interpretation. When we examine the specific teachings that survived the editorial process, we find a remarkable consistency with Roman imperial values. The emphasis on rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, the commandment to obey governmental authorities, the teaching that all power comes from God and should be respected accordingly. These aren't accidental similarities, but systematic reinforcement of imperial ideology. Consider how Christian teachings about slavery aligned perfectly with Roman economic interests. Instead of condemning slavery as an abomination, Christian texts counseled slaves to obey their masters and find spiritual freedom through physical bondage. Masters were encouraged to treat slaves kindly, but the institution itself was never challenged. This approach served Roman interests perfectly by maintaining the economic system while reducing the likelihood of slave revolts through religious pacification. The Christian approach to military service followed similar patterns. Rather than rejecting violence entirely, Christian doctrine developed complex theories about just war that allowed Romans to continue their military campaigns while maintaining their spiritual purity. Christians were taught that earthly warfare was acceptable when conducted under legitimate authority, which conveniently meant Roman authority in most practical situations. Even Christian sexual ethics served imperial demographic policies. The emphasis on celibacy and spiritual marriage reduced population growth among potentially rebellious populations, while encouraging the kind of otherworldly focus that discouraged political engagement. Christian communities were taught to see themselves as pilgrims passing through this world, rather than citizens with stakes in improving it. This systematic alignment between Christian teaching and Roman policy extends across virtually every area of social life. Christian doctrine on economics discouraged the accumulation of wealth while encouraging charitable giving, which had the practical effect of preventing the concentration of resources that might fund resistance movements while creating support networks that reduced social unrest. Christian teachings about family relationships reinforced patriarchal hierarchies that paralleled imperial administrative structures. The theological sophistication required to achieve this level of systematic alignment suggests professional rather than amateur authorship. Creating a religious system that serves political purposes while maintaining spiritual authenticity requires deep understanding of both theology and statecraft. The Flavian court had access to both kinds of expertise through their network of Jewish collaborators and Roman intellectuals. This professional approach becomes apparent when we examine how Christian theology solved specific political problems that the empire was facing. The Jewish rebellion had been fueled by messianic expectations that couldn't be simply suppressed through military force. The Flavians needed a way to redirect these expectations rather than eliminate them entirely. And Christianity provided exactly that solution. By creating a Messiah who achieved victory through defeat, who conquered through submission, who ruled through service, the Flavian authors transformed Jewish messianic expectations into their opposite. Christians could feel they were following a triumphant king while actually behaving like obedient subjects. They could believe they were part of a revolutionary movement while supporting the established order. This theological jiu-jitsu extended to Christian eschatology, the doctrine of end times. Instead of expecting an earthly kingdom that would overthrow Roman rule, Christians were taught to expect a heavenly kingdom that would transcend earthly politics entirely. The revolutionary energy that had fueled Jewish resistance was channeled into otherworldly hopes that posed no threat to imperial stability. The Christian concept of the afterlife served similar functions. By promising rewards and punishments after death, Christian theology created a system of ultimate justice that didn't require earthly intervention. People who suffered under Roman rule could find comfort in believing that their oppressors would eventually face divine judgment, which reduced the psychological pressure for immediate resistance. This otherworldly focus was reinforced by Christian teachings about the temporary nature of earthly life. If this world was merely a testing ground for eternal existence, then improving conditions here became less important than maintaining spiritual purity. Christians were encouraged to endure suffering patiently rather than work actively to eliminate its causes. The practical effect of these teachings was to create a population that was easier to govern. Christian subjects were more likely to pay taxes willingly, less likely to rebel against authority, and more inclined to channel their dissatisfaction into prayer rather than political action. From an imperial perspective, Christianity was the perfect subject religion. But the Flavian innovation went beyond simply creating compliant subjects. They appear to have engineered a religion that would actively promote imperial values while convinced they were opposing believers them. Christians didn't just submit to Roman authority, they internalized Roman hierarchical thinking and reproduced it within their own communities. The Christian Church developed administrative structures that mirrored imperial bureaucracy, with bishops corresponding to provincial governors and elaborate hierarchies that paralleled Roman administrative ranks. Christian worship adopted ceremonial elements from imperial cult practices, including the use of incense, elaborate vestments, and ritualized prostration before authority figures. Even Christian art and architecture reflected imperial aesthetic principles. Early Christian churches were built according to Roman basilica designs, which had originally been used for imperial administrative buildings. Christian religious imagery borrowed heavily from imperial iconography, with Christ often depicted wearing imperial regalia and sitting on thrones modeled after those used by Roman emperors. This aesthetic continuity wasn't accidental, but reflected the deeper continuity between Christian and imperial ideology. The religion that claimed to represent the poor and oppressed actually reproduced the visual and organizational culture of their oppressors. Christians learned to think hierarchically, to respect authority, to find beauty in displays of power and wealth. The psychological sophistication of this approach becomes apparent when we consider its long-term effectiveness. Rather than creating resentment through obvious oppression, the Flavian system generated loyalty through the illusion of spiritual liberation. Christians felt they were part of something greater than themselves, something that transcended and therefore justified earthly inequalities. This sense of cosmic significance helped compensate for material deprivation and political powerlessness. Christians could accept poverty and oppression more easily when they believed these conditions had spiritual meaning. their suffering wasn't meaningless injustice but divine testing that would ultimately lead to eternal reward. The communal aspect of Christianity reinforced these psychological effects. Christian communities provided social support and identity that helped individuals cope with the challenges of life under imperial rule. But this support came at the cost of intellectual independence, as community membership required acceptance of orthodox beliefs that served imperial interests. The emphasis on faith over reason discouraged the kind of critical thinking that might lead to questioning authority. Christians were taught to accept religious teachings on faith and to distrust their own rational faculties when these conflicted with revealed truth. This anti-intellectual orientation made Christian populations less likely to develop the analytical skills necessary for effective political resistance. Christian education reinforced these tendencies by focusing on scriptural interpretation rather than practical problem-solving. Christian scholars spent their intellectual energy on theological debates that had no bearing on material conditions, rather than developing strategies for social improvement. The most brilliant minds in Christian communities were channeled into activities that served imperial stability by diverting them from potentially subversive pursuits. The result was a population that was both intellectually sophisticated and politically passive. Christians could engage in complex theological discussions while remaining remarkably uncritical about the political systems under which they lived. They developed elaborate theories about divine justice while accepting earthly injustice as inevitable. This combination of intellectual activity and political passivity created the ideal imperial subjects. They were educated enough to participate effectively in Roman economic and administrative systems, but not independent enough to challenge those systems fundamentally. They provided the skilled labor and administrative expertise that the empire needed while posing minimal threat to imperial stability. The Flavian approach to religious engineering thus solved multiple problems simultaneously. It neutralized Jewish messianic expectations, provided a unifying ideology for diverse imperial populations, created compliant subjects who governed themselves through internalized discipline, and generated intellectual energy that served imperial rather than revolutionary purposes. The success of this system becomes apparent when we examine how Christianity evolved over its first few centuries. Rather than becoming more radical or more threatening to imperial authority, Christianity became increasingly institutionalized and politically conservative. The religion that had allegedly begun as a movement of the dispossessed became the preferred faith of emperors and aristocrats. This evolution makes sense if Christianity was designed from the beginning to serve imperial interests. The apparent transformation from revolutionary movement to establishment religion wasn't a betrayal of original Christian principles, but the fulfillment of the program that had been embedded within those principles from the start. The theological developments that accompanied this institutionalization consistently favored interpretations that supported hierarchical authority over those that emphasized equality or social justice. Christian doctrine on the Trinity, for example, reinforced concepts of legitimate authority and proper submission that paralleled imperial political theory. The development of papal supremacy created a religious monarchy that mirrored and supported earthly monarchy. Even Christian mysticism, which might seem to offer escape from institutional control, was channeled in directions that served imperial purposes. Christian mystics were encouraged to seek union with divine authority rather than to develop independent spiritual insights. The most revered Christian saints were those who demonstrated perfect obedience to ecclesiastical authority, rather than those who challenged social conventions. The systematic nature of these theological developments suggests coordination rather than organic evolution. The same principles that guided the original creation of Christian texts appear to have continued shaping Christian theology throughout its early development. The religion remained true to its alleged Flavian origins by consistently serving the interests of established power. This pattern continued even after the Flavian dynasty itself had passed into history. Subsequent Roman emperors inherited and refined the religious system that their predecessors had created, using it to maintain stability across an increasingly diverse and potentially fractious empire. Christianity became a tool of imperial administration that transcended any particular ruling family. The conversion of Constantine in the 4th century represents not a transformation of imperial policy, but its culmination. By making Christianity the official religion of the empire, Constantine wasn't surrendering to a foreign ideology, but claiming ownership of a system that had always served imperial purposes. The religion had proven so effective at creating compliant subjects that it deserved official recognition and support. The Council of Nicaea that Constantine convened wasn't primarily concerned with theological truth, but with administrative efficiency. By standardizing Christian doctrine, the council created a unified ideological system that could be used to govern diverse populations more effectively. The theological disputes that were resolved at Nicaea were essentially political questions about how to organize imperial subjects for maximum controllability. The resulting Nicene Creed wasn't just a statement of religious belief, but a loyalty oath that bound Christians to a particular interpretation of their faith. Those who refused to accept orthodox doctrine were excluded from Christian communities and thereby lost access to the social and economic networks that Christianity provided. Orthodoxy became a requirement for full participation in imperial society. This process of theological standardization eliminated the diversity of early Christian thought that might have posed challenges to imperial authority. Gnostic Christianity, which emphasized individual spiritual authority and direct relationship with the divine, was suppressed in favor of institutional Christianity that required mediation through official channels. Arian Christianity, which challenged hierarchical concepts of divine authority, was condemned as heretical. The consistent pattern was to eliminate interpretations of Christianity that might encourage independent thinking or resistance to authority, while promoting those that reinforced submission and obedience. The theological development of Christianity followed political rather than spiritual logic, consistently serving the needs of imperial administration. This administrative approach to religion extended to every aspect of Christian institutional life. The development of canon law created a legal system that paralleled and supported imperial law. Christian courts handled disputes in ways that reinforced imperial concepts of justice and authority. Christian education taught imperial values through religious instruction. The integration of Christian and imperial systems became so complete that distinguishing between religious and political authority became increasingly difficult. Bishops functioned as imperial administrators. Christian festivals followed imperial calendar systems, and Christian moral teachings reinforced imperial social policies. This fusion of religious and political authority created an incredibly stable system of social control. Christians couldn't rebel against imperial authority without also rebelling against their own religious beliefs. They couldn't question political hierarchies without questioning divine hierarchies. They couldn't seek earthly liberation without abandoning their hopes for heavenly salvation. The psychological bind was nearly perfect. The more devoutly Christian people became, the more politically passive they became. The stronger their religious faith, the weaker their capacity for political resistance. The religion that promised to set them free actually bound them more tightly to the system that oppressed them. This brings us to one of the most disturbing aspects of the entire Flavian thesis. If Christianity really was engineered as a control mechanism, then its moral teachings about love, compassion, and justice become instruments of manipulation rather than genuine ethical insights. The religion's most admirable qualities become evidence of its creator's cynical sophistication rather than proof of its divine origin. The emphasis on loving one's enemies, for example, takes on a sinister quality when viewed as a technique for neutralizing resistance to oppression. The teaching that the meek shall inherit the earth becomes a strategy for encouraging passivity among the dispossessed. The commandment to turn the other cheek transforms from moral wisdom into psychological warfare. This doesn't mean that these teachings are inherently evil or that they can't inspire genuine moral development. But it does suggest that moral principles can be weaponized by those who understand human psychology well enough to manipulate it effectively. The same teachings that help individuals develop greater compassion can also be used to create populations that are easier to exploit. The Flavian approach to moral manipulation appears to have been remarkably subtle and sophisticated. Rather than creating obviously oppressive doctrines that would generate resistance, they embedded imperial values within genuinely appealing moral frameworks. People could embrace Christian ethics sincerely while unknowingly serving imperial interests. This technique of moral camouflage has proven incredibly durable and continues to influence how power structures maintain themselves today. Contemporary examples might include corporate social responsibility programs that deflect criticism while maintaining exploitative practices, or political movements that use moral rhetoric to advance policies that serve elite interests. Understanding how this technique works doesn't require us to become cynical about all moral claims, but it does suggest the importance of examining the practical effects of moral teachings, rather than simply accepting them at face value. Good intentions aren't enough if the actual results serve oppressive purposes, regardless of what those intentions might be. The Flavian thesis forces us to confront the possibility that some of humanity's most cherished moral and spiritual insights might have originated as tools of social control. This doesn't necessarily invalidate those insights, but it does complicate our understanding of their meaning and significance. The question becomes whether moral truth can exist independently of the intentions of those who first articulated it. Can teachings about love and compassion retain their validity, even if they were originally designed to serve manipulative purposes? How do we distinguish between genuine spiritual wisdom and sophisticated psychological manipulation? These questions don't have simple answers, but they highlight the importance of developing critical thinking skills that can help us navigate complex moral and spiritual landscapes. The ability to appreciate genuine wisdom while remaining alert to manipulation becomes crucial for anyone seeking both personal development and political freedom. The investigation into Christian origins through the lens of the Flavian thesis ultimately becomes an investigation into the nature of truth itself. How do we know what we know? How do we distinguish between authentic insight and manufactured belief? How do we maintain intellectual independence while remaining open to genuine wisdom from whatever source it might come? These epistemological questions are particularly urgent in our current information environment, where sophisticated manipulation techniques are more powerful and pervasive than ever before. Understanding how the Flavians may have engineered religious belief can help us recognize when similar techniques are being used in contemporary contexts. The same psychological principles that made Christianity effective as a tool of imperial control continue to operate in modern propaganda, advertising, and political messaging. The techniques for creating compliance through the illusion of freedom, for channeling dissatisfaction into harmless outlets, for making oppression feel like liberation, all remain relevant to anyone seeking to understand how power operates in the 21st century. But perhaps the most important lesson from the Flavian thesis isn't about Christianity specifically, but about the ongoing struggle between authentic human development and sophisticated social control. Every generation faces this struggle in new forms, and understanding how previous generations were manipulated can help us recognize and resist the manipulation techniques of our own time. The Flavians may have won their particular battle by creating a religious system that served imperial interests for centuries, but their victory was never complete, and the human desire for genuine liberation continues to find expression in new forms. The questions they raise about the relationship between truth and power, between spiritual insight and political manipulation, between individual freedom and social control, remain as relevant today as they were 2,000 years ago. The story of Christianity's origins, whether we accept the Flavian thesis or not, reminds us that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, not just against obvious forms of oppression, but against the subtle manipulation of our deepest beliefs and highest aspirations. The most effective forms of control are those that convince us we're free, And the most important form of resistance may be the simple willingness to question everything, especially those ideas we hold most sacred. In the end, the investigation into Caesar's Messiah becomes an investigation into the nature of human consciousness itself and our ongoing capacity to distinguish between authentic wisdom and sophisticated deception. Whether the Romans really did invent Christianity may be less important than what the possibility teaches us about the eternal struggle between those who seek to control and those who seek to remain free. The questions raised by scholars like Joseph Atwill and others don't require us to abandon spiritual seeking or moral development, but they do suggest the importance of approaching these pursuits with both openness and critical awareness. The goal isn't to become cynical about all claims to truth, but to develop the discernment necessary to distinguish between genuine insight and clever manipulation. This discernment becomes particularly crucial when examining religious and political movements that claim to offer salvation or liberation. The more grandiose the promises, the more important it becomes to examine the practical effects and hidden motivations behind those promises. True liberation is more likely to come through clear seeing and independent thinking than through blind faith in any external authority, no matter how appealing its message might be. The legacy of the Flavians, if the thesis is correct, serves as a permanent reminder that even our most sacred beliefs deserve careful scrutiny, not because such scrutiny will necessarily destroy those beliefs, but because only beliefs that can withstand honest examination are worthy of our deepest commitment. The truth, whatever it might be, has nothing to fear from investigation, and so the mystery of Christian origins continues to unfold, raising more questions than it answers, challenging us to think more deeply about the nature of truth, power, and human freedom. Whether we ultimately accept or reject the Flavian thesis, the investigation itself serves the cause of human liberation by demonstrating that no belief system, no matter how ancient or revered, should be immune from honest inquiry. The greatest conspiracy in history may not be the invention of Christianity by Roman emperors, but the ongoing attempt by various power structures throughout history to convince human beings that they're not capable of thinking for themselves. Against this conspiracy, the best defense remains what it has always been: the courage to ask difficult questions and the wisdom to keep seeking truth wherever it might lead, regardless of how uncomfortable that truth might turn out to be. This systematic approach to theological engineering becomes even more remarkable when we examine the specific mechanisms the Flavians used to embed their political messages within religious narratives. The technique they employed, known as typological parallelism, represents one of the most sophisticated forms of literary manipulation ever documented in ancient texts. Typology was already a well-established method in Jewish religious writing, used to connect different prophets and historical events through recurring patterns that suggested divine orchestration. The Flavians appears to have studied this technique extensively during their possession of captured Jewish scriptures, then adapted it for their own purposes with devastating effectiveness. The beauty of typological writing lies in its ability to communicate different messages to different audiences simultaneously. Surface readers encounter one story, while those trained to recognize the underlying patterns discover entirely different meanings embedded within the same text. For the Flavians, this created the perfect vehicle for religious propaganda that could appear authentically Jewish while serving Roman imperial interests. When we trace these typological connections between the Gospels and Josephus's historical accounts, the parallels become impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Both narratives follow geographical identical progressions, moving from Galilee through the Judean countryside to Jerusalem. Both involve protagonists who gather followers, encounter resistance, and ultimately achieve their goals through apparent defeat. Both culminate in events that fundamentally transform the relationship between Jews and Romans, But the parallels extend far beyond broad narrative structure into specific details that reveal the sophisticated literary craftsmanship behind the Gospel accounts. Consider the episode where Jesus feeds 5,000 people with just a few loaves and fishes. This miracle story takes on entirely different meaning when we discover that Josephus describes Titus feeding his troops in the exact same location, using supplies captured from Jewish rebels. The Gospel account transforms a military logistics operation into a spiritual allegory, but the underlying message remains consistent with Roman interests. Just as Titus provided material sustenance to his followers through conquest, Jesus provides spiritual sustenance to his followers through submission. The miracle becomes a metaphor for how Roman rule could satisfy the deepest hungers of subject populations. Even more striking is the parallel between Jesus' cleansing of the temple and Titus's actual destruction of that same building. In the Gospel account, Jesus drives out the money changers and declares that his Father's house should not be made into a den of thieves. In Josephus' history, Titus literally cleanses the temple by destroying it completely, eliminating what he regarded as a center of rebellion and corruption. The typological connection suggests that Jesus' symbolic cleansing prophetically validates Titus's physical destruction. The Gospel narrative prepares readers to interpret the temple's destruction not as a catastrophe, but as divine judgment carried out through Roman agency. What appeared to be imperial conquest becomes reframed as messianic fulfillment. This reframing technique appears throughout the Gospel narratives, consistently transforming Roman military victories into spiritual triumphs that serve Jewish prophetic expectations. The psychological sophistication of this approach cannot be overstated. Instead of forcing Jews to abandon their messianic hopes, the Flavians appear to have redirected those hopes toward outcomes that served Roman interests. The technique becomes even more sophisticated when we examine how the Gospel authors handled the problem of Jesus' crucifixion. Execution by crucifixion was specifically associated with crimes against the Roman state, particularly sedition and rebellion. Any authentic Jewish Messiah who died in this manner would have been understood as a failed revolutionary rather than a spiritual teacher. The Flavian authors solved this problem by transforming crucifixion from a symbol of political failure into a symbol of spiritual victory. They accomplished this through careful literary construction that emphasized Jesus' voluntary acceptance of death rather than his defeat by Roman power. The crucifixion becomes not something done to Jesus, but something he chooses for redemptive purposes. This theological innovation served multiple Roman interests simultaneously. It removed the political stigma from crucifixion while maintaining its effectiveness as a deterrent to actual rebellion. Jews could identify with a crucified Messiah without being inspired to resist Roman authority themselves. The symbol of imperial justice became transformed into a symbol of divine love. The resurrection narrative completes this transformation by suggesting that apparent defeat by Roman power actually represents ultimate victory over death itself. The message becomes clear. Submission to Roman authority, even unto death, leads not to destruction, but to eternal life. Political resistance becomes not just futile, but spiritually counterproductive. This theological framework provided the perfect foundation for the kind of pacifist Judaism that Roman administrators had long sought to cultivate. Instead of the militant messianism that had fueled the Jewish rebellion, Christianity offered a form of religious expression that channeled revolutionary energy into spiritual rather than political directions. The effectiveness of this approach becomes apparent when we examine how quickly Christian communities developed throughout the Roman Empire. Rather than facing the systematic persecution that had destroyed other religious movements, Christianity spread along Roman trade routes and established itself in Roman administrative centers with remarkable ease. The speed of this expansion suggests institutional support rather than grassroots evangelism. Christian missionaries appear to have had access to Roman infrastructure and protection that would have been unavailable to genuinely subversive movements. The religion that claimed to challenge worldly authority actually relied on that same authority for its propagation and survival. Archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. Early Christian sites show remarkably little evidence of the destruction and concealment we might expect from a persecuted underground movement. Instead, Christian art, architecture, and burial practices developed openly and incorporated Roman artistic conventions from the beginning. The famous Christian fish symbol, for example, appears to have been adapted from existing Roman imperial iconography rather than created independently. The anchor, dove, and other early Christian symbols similarly show Roman influence in their design and execution. Even Christian crosses incorporate decorative elements borrowed from Roman military and administrative symbols. This artistic continuity reflects deeper theological continuity between Christianity and Roman imperial religion. The Christian concept of divine sonship mirrors Roman imperial theology about the divine nature of Caesars. Christian ideas about sacrifice and redemption parallel Roman concepts about the emperor's role in mediating between gods and humans. Christian organizational structures reproduce Roman administrative hierarchies. The theological sophistication required to achieve this level of synthesis suggests professional authorship, rather than the spontaneous religious insights of uneducated peasants. Creating a religion that could successfully combine Jewish, Greek, and Roman elements while serving specific political purposes required deep understanding of all three traditions, plus considerable literary skill. The Flavian court possessed exactly this combination of resources and expertise. They had captured Jewish religious texts and could study them in detail. They had access to Greek philosophical traditions, Opolitan intellectual their cosm through networks. They understood Roman political needs through direct involvement in imperial administration. Most importantly, they had demonstrated their ability to manipulate religious beliefs through their previous campaigns against the Druids. The Druidic precedent is particularly significant because it shows that the Flavians had already perfected techniques for religious destruction and replacement. In Britain and Gaul, they had systematically eliminated an entire religious system so thoroughly that virtually no trace of authentic Druidic literature or practice survived. This demonstrated both their motivation and their capability for large-scale religious engineering. The Christian project appears to have been more sophisticated than their Druidic campaign because it involved creation rather than mere destruction. Instead of simply eliminating Jewish messianic expectations, they redirected those expectations toward outcomes that served Roman interests. This approach proved far more effective because it satisfied psychological needs while eliminating political threats. The psychological sophistication of the Flavian approach becomes apparent when we consider how successfully it solved the problem of imperial legitimacy. Previous Roman dynasties had relied primarily on military conquest and administrative efficiency to justify their rule. The Flavians discovered how to make their subjects want to be ruled by convincing them that submission was actually a form of spiritual liberation. This transformation of political relationships into religious ones represents one of the most significant innovations in the history of social control. Instead of ruling through fear, the Flavians learned to rule through love. Instead of demanding obedience through force, they inspired obedience through faith. Instead of suppressing resistance, they redirected it towards spiritually satisfying but politically harmless activities. The long-term effectiveness of this approach is demonstrated by Christianity's subsequent history. For nearly 2 millennia, Christian populations have generally supported rather than challenged existing political authorities. Even when Christians have engaged in social reform movements, they have typically worked within established institutional frameworks rather than advocating for fundamental, systemic change. This pattern persists even in contemporary contexts where Christian rhetoric appears to challenge authority. Liberation theology, for example, uses Christian language to advocate for social justice, but it ultimately channels revolutionary energy toward religious rather than political solutions. Christian socialism similarly combines radical social criticism with otherworldly ultimate hopes that reduce pressure for immediate political transformation. The consistency of this pattern across different cultures and historical periods suggests that it reflects something fundamental about Christian theology rather than external political pressures. The religion appears to contain built-in mechanisms that redirect political energy towards spiritual outlets, regardless of the specific social conditions which it operates. These inbuilt-in mechanisms become particularly apparent when we examine Christian teachings about authority, suffering, and justice. The commandment to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's establishes a fundamental division between spiritual and political realms that consistently favors existing political arrangements. The emphasis on patient endurance of suffering discourages the kind of immediate action that might challenge unjust conditions. The promise of ultimate divine justice reduces pressure for human justice in the present moment. Even Christian teachings about love and compassion serve these same functions when examined in political context. The commandment to love one's enemies becomes a mandate to accept oppression without resistance. The emphasis on forgiveness discourages accountability for those who abuse power. The focus on individual moral transformation deflects attention from systemic problems that require collective political solutions. This doesn't mean that Christian teachings are inherently oppressive, or that they can't inspire genuine moral development. Many individuals have found authentic spiritual growth through Christian practice, and many Christian communities have contributed positively to social welfare and human rights. But it does suggest that the religion's fundamental theological framework consistently serves the interests of established power structures. The Flavian authors appear to have understood human psychology well enough to create a religious system that satisfies spiritual needs while neutralizing political aspirations. They discovered how to make oppression feel like liberation, how to make submission feel like victory, how to make powerlessness feel like spiritual strength. This psychological sophistication extends to every aspect of Christian theology. The doctrine of original sin creates a sense of fundamental human inadequacy that makes people more dependent on external authority. The emphasis on faith over reason discourages the kind of critical thinking that might lead to questioning authority. The promise of afterlife rewards compensates for earthly deprivations in ways that reduce motivation for improving material conditions. The concept of divine providence serves similar functions by suggesting that all events, including suffering and oppression, occur according to divine plan. This theology makes resistance to unjust conditions seem not just futile, but actually sinful, since it implies opposition to God's will. People learn to accept their circumstances passively, rather than working actively to change them. Christian eschatology reinforces these tendencies by focusing attention on future divine intervention, rather than present human action. The expectation of Christ's second coming creates a psychological orientation toward waiting rather than acting, toward hoping rather than doing. Revolutionary energy becomes channeled into prayer and contemplation rather than practical political organization. The cumulative effect of these theological elements is to create populations that are spiritually engaged but politically passive. Christian subjects can feel deeply connected to cosmic purposes while remaining remarkably uncritical about earthly injustices. They develop sophisticated ways of thinking about ultimate questions while maintaining childlike attitudes toward immediate ones. This combination of spiritual sophistication and political naivety creates ideal imperial subjects. They possess the intellectual capacity to participate effectively in complex economic and administrative systems, while lacking the critical awareness that might lead them to challenge those systems fundamentally. They provide skilled labor and cultural stability without posing threats to existing power arrangements. The Flavian innovation was to discover that religious belief could be more effective than military force for maintaining social control. A population that policed itself through internalized spiritual discipline required fewer external resources for management than one that had to be controlled through constant surveillance and punishment. Christianity provided a self-regulating system that made imperial administration more efficient, and less expensive. This efficiency explains why subsequent Roman emperors continued to support and develop the Christian system even after the Flavian dynasty had ended. The religion had proven so useful for imperial administration that it became institutionalized as a permanent feature of Roman governance. Christian bishops became imperial administrators, Christian law became civil law, and Christian moral teaching became state ideology. The conversion of Constantine represents not a transformation of imperial policy, but its logical culmination. By making Christianity the official religion of the empire, Constantine wasn't surrendering to a foreign ideology, but claiming ownership of a system that had always served imperial purposes. The religion had demonstrated its utility so convincingly that it deserved official recognition and support. The Council of Nicaea that Constantine convened served primarily administrative rather than theological purposes. By standardizing Christian doctrine, the council created ideological uniformity that made imperial governance more efficient. Theological disputes were resolved not according to spiritual truth, but according to political utility. The resulting creed served as both a statement of faith and a loyalty oath that bound Christian subjects to particular interpretations of their religion. This process of theological standardization eliminated diversity of Christian thought that might have posed challenges to imperial authority. Alternative interpretations of Christianity that emphasized individual spiritual authority, social equality, or resistance to unjust power were systematically suppressed. Orthodox Christianity became defined not by its spiritual authenticity, but by its political usefulness. The long-term success of this standardization process demonstrates the effectiveness of the original Flavian design. The religion proved resilient enough to maintain its essential character across different political systems and cultural contexts, while remaining flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances. The same theological framework that served Roman imperial interests continued to serve the interests of subsequent political arrangements throughout European and world history. This adaptability suggests that the Flavian authors understood something fundamental about the relationship between religious belief and political power. They created a system that could evolve with changing circumstances while maintaining its essential function as a mechanism of social control. The specific content of Christian teaching could be modified to suit different situations, but the underlying structure that channeled religious energy away from political resistance remained constant. Contemporary Christianity continues to demonstrate this same pattern. Despite enormous changes in social, economic, and political conditions over the past 2 millennia, Christian communities continue to exhibit the same basic tendency toward political passivity and acceptance of authority that characterized the earliest Christian populations. The religion adapts its surface features to contemporary contexts while preserving its essential function as a force for social stability rather than social transformation. This continuity across such different historical periods suggests that we're dealing with something more sophisticated than simple political opportunism. The Flavian authors appear to have discovered principles of social psychology that transcend any particular political system. They learned how to create religious beliefs that serve power structures generally rather than just Roman imperial interests specifically. Understanding these principles becomes crucial for anyone seeking to maintain intellectual and spiritual independence in contemporary contexts. The same techniques that made Christianity effective as a tool of imperial control continue to operate in modern political, economic, and social systems. Learning to recognize these techniques can help us distinguish between authentic spiritual wisdom and sophisticated psychological manipulation. The key insight from the Flavian thesis is that the most effective forms of social control are those that convince people they're free, when submission feels like liberation, when powerlessness feels like spiritual strength, when acceptance of injustice feels like moral virtue, then control becomes nearly perfect because it operates through the subject's own consciousness rather than through external force. This principle has enormous implications for how we evaluate not just religious teachings, but all forms of ideology and belief. The question isn't whether particular ideas make us feel good or provide psychological comfort, but whether they enhance or diminish our capacity for independent thought and effective action in the world. Christianity, in this analysis, represents a cautionary tale about how even our highest aspirations can be co-opted and redirected toward purposes we never intended. The desire for spiritual meaning, moral development, and connection to transcendent purpose are genuine human needs that deserve authentic fulfillment. But these same needs can be exploited by those who understand how to provide satisfying substitutes that serve their own interests rather than our genuine development. The challenge for contemporary spiritual seekers is to find ways of meeting these authentic needs without falling into the psychological traps that may have been embedded within traditional religious systems. This requires developing new forms of spiritual discernment that can distinguish between teachings that genuinely liberate consciousness and those that subtly enslave it. Such discernment becomes particularly important when examining religious or spiritual movements that make grandiose claims about salvation, liberation, or transformation. The more dramatic the promises, the more important it becomes to examine the practical effects of accepting those promises. True spiritual development is more likely to enhance our capacity for clear thinking and effective action than to diminish it. The investigation into Christianity's origins thus becomes an investigation into the nature of authentic spirituality itself. Whether or not the Flavians actually created Christianity, the possibility forces us to ask deeper questions about how to distinguish between genuine spiritual wisdom and sophisticated psychological manipulation. These questions remain as relevant today as they were 2,000 years ago, and perhaps more urgent given the increasing sophistication of contemporary manipulation techniques. The answers to these questions won't be found in accepting any external authority, religious or otherwise, but in developing our own capacity for independent spiritual investigation. The Flavian thesis, regardless of whether we ultimately accept or reject it, serves the valuable function of demonstrating that no belief system, no matter how ancient or revered, should be immune from honest inquiry. In the end, the greatest service we can perform for authentic spirituality may be to subject all spiritual claims to rigorous examination, not to destroy them, but to separate what is genuinely valuable from what merely appears to be so. The truth, whatever it might be, has nothing to fear from investigation. Only illusions require protection from honest questioning. The story of Caesar's Messiah, whether ultimately true or false, reminds us that the price of spiritual freedom is the same as the price of political freedom. Eternal vigilance against those who would manipulate our deepest needs and highest aspirations for their own purposes. The investigation continues, and the questions it raises about truth, power, and human consciousness remain as vital today as they were when Roman emperors first learned that conquering minds could be more effective than conquering territories. The implications of this investigation extend far beyond academic debates about ancient history. If the Flavian thesis proves accurate, it suggests that one of humanity's most influential belief systems was engineered not to liberate the human spirit, but to constrain it within acceptable boundaries. The techniques they allegedly pioneered continue to echo through contemporary power structures, from corporate messaging that transforms consumption into virtue, to political movements that channel genuine grievances toward harmless outlets. Consider how modern propaganda operates through similar mechanisms. Just as Christianity may have redirected Jewish messianic energy away from political resistance, contemporary movements often capture authentic desires for change and redirect them toward activities that pose no real threat to existing systems. Environmental activism becomes focused on individual lifestyle choices rather than systemic economic transformation. Social justice movements become channeled through institutional frameworks that absorb and neutralize their revolutionary potential. the psychological techniques remain remarkably consistent across centuries. Create a narrative that satisfies emotional needs while serving power interests. Provide symbols and rituals that generate feelings of participation without actual agency. Promise future rewards that compensate for present powerlessness. Most importantly, convince people that their compliance represents a form of resistance, that their submission constitutes a kind of victory. This pattern appears so frequently throughout history that it suggests something fundamental about how consciousness can be shaped and directed. The human need for meaning, purpose, and transcendence creates vulnerabilities that sophisticated operators learn to exploit. What begins as authentic spiritual seeking becomes gradually redirected toward outcomes that serve the seeker's controllers rather than the seekers themselves. The Christian example becomes particularly instructive because it demonstrates how complete this redirection can become. Followers genuinely believe they're participating in divine revolution while actually supporting earthly oppression. They experience profound spiritual emotions while remaining politically passive. They develop elaborate theological systems that justify their own subjugation while making that subjugation feel like liberation. This psychological sophistication suggests that the Flavians, if indeed they created Christianity, understood human nature at levels that modern psychologists are only beginning to appreciate. They discovered how to hijack the human search for meaning and redirect it towards socially useful purposes. They learned to transform revolutionary energy into conservative force, to make submission feel like triumph, to turn the desire for freedom into acceptance of bondage. The techniques they developed appear to have been so effective that they've become embedded within the basic structure of Western civilization. The same patterns that allegedly characterized early Christianity continue to operate within secular contexts. Democratic political systems channel popular energy toward choices that don't threaten fundamental power arrangements. Educational institutions teach critical thinking about some topics while discouraging examination of others. Media systems provide the illusion of diverse viewpoints while maintaining consensus on essential questions. Whether Caesar's Messiah represents historical fact or provocative theory, the questions it raises demand our attention. The evidence we've explored suggests that those in power have always understood that controlling beliefs can be more effective than controlling bodies. The same techniques that may have transformed Jewish messianic fervor into Roman compliance continue operating today in new forms. As we navigate our own complex information landscape, the investigation itself becomes more valuable than any definitive answer. The price of intellectual freedom remains what it has always been: the courage to question everything, especially those ideas we hold most sacred. Because in the end, authentic liberation begins not with accepting any external authority, but with developing our own capacity to distinguish truth from sophisticated deception.